Hello and welcome to Model Minutes. Today's video is a beginner's guide to the Airfix Supermarine Spitfire Mk1a in 1/72nd scale. Before we start the kit, as always, remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Airfix recommends this kit for those aged 8 years old or over. Normally in my videos I assume that people watching have a little understanding of model kit construction, but for this one I'm going to break it down a bit more for those of you who've been out of the modelling hobby for a while or are thinking of getting started for the first time. I've chosen to do a beginner's guide with this kit as it seems to be one of the most popular for first timers, especially from those I've spoken to out there in the community. So let's get started. The Spitfire starter kit consists of 2 light grey plastic sprues containing the main components and an additional clear sprue which consists of the cockpit canopy. The sprue is the extra part of the kit containing all the main components, and these parts will need to be cut away from the sprue in order to assemble the model kit. The sprue can then be recycled or reused depending on what you want to do with it. The instructions consist of an A4 booklet, which contain information about the actual Supermarine Spitfire, safety warnings, and general information about how to read the instructions and prepare the parts for assembly. Make sure you spend a little time studying the instructions, as the steps and diagrams for assembling the model can be confusing at times. Patience will be key here. A sheet of water slide decals are included. This is the little sheet of what looks like stickers. Put them to one side safely as we'll need them later. Inside this kit you also get 4 acrylic paints which consist of Humbrol 29 brown, 30 dark green, 33 matte black and 90 which is a sort of whitish green. A little tube of polycement and a paintbrush is also included. I do recommend some extra paints, but we will get to that later. It would also be worth getting a few extra tools too, such as a scalpel or hobby knife, some tweezers to hold the fine parts, some clothes pegs to hold parts whilst they glue together, a nail file and some extra paintbrushes. Also, the green mat you can see in my video is a self-healing cutting mat in A3 size. I use this to protect the table that I'm working on from damage from cutting tools and accidental spills of paints and glues, which sometimes happens. It is worth noting before we get started that the token on the side of the box is worth cutting out. It's called a flying hour, and if you join the Airfix Club you can redeem these against more kits. I've never done this, so have quite a stash of these tokens. Perhaps I'll join the club one day and see which kits I can get. So with all that out of the way and a better understanding of what's going on, let's start building the kit. The first step I chose to complete was to wash the plastic parts in warm soapy water. The instructions recommend you do this in order to remove any oil or grease left over from the moulding process. This will help give the cement and paints a better surface to stick to. Once clean, leave them to air dry. Don't use any cloths as this can put dust or fibres on the model and spoil the finish. When dry, I decided to paint all the internal parts of the model with Humbrol 78 acrylic, which is a light green colour. This paint is not included with the kit, but I had it left over from a previous model and thought it would be a better colour than the recommended number 30 in the instructions. I painted the majority of the small components whilst they were still on the sprue. This was so that I wouldn't lose them. I painted the pilot with the suggested colours, but picked out his face in Humbrol 61 flesh colour and his life jacket in 24 yellow. I also painted the wheels and the internal areas where the guns would be mounted with Humbrol 33 black. The control panel of the aircraft will require one of the decals to be applied. Cutting the required decal from the sheet and then soaking in warm water, it will then slide off the backing paper. It can then be positioned in the correct place on the relevant plastic component. I go into more detail about decal application later, so stay tuned. Up next is where we start the actual construction of the kit. I removed all of the components for the cockpit from the sprue using a sharp knife. Any rough parts were then sanded with a nail file. Identifying the correct parts as per the instructions, they can then be assembled together. A little paint will have to be scraped away from any surfaces that are going to be cemented together. This is so that the poly cement has a better surface to bond to. The cockpit parts were glued together, but this can be a fiddly process, so some tweezers might be handy at this point to hold them whilst they are put in position. Having assembled the cockpit components, I then decided to build the propeller parts, again cutting them from the sprue and following the instructions to glue them together. If you are careful, the propeller can be made to turn freely, so be careful where you're putting that cement. Next came the fuselage halves of the Spitfire, cutting them from the sprue and sanding the rough areas with a nail file. The cockpit components can then be installed. Take your time with this step, as it can be a little difficult, but Airfix have done a great job of designing this kit, and the parts will fit together really well. When the cockpit is finished, the propeller assembly can then be added onto the model as well. The two fuselage halves can be cemented together and align really well thanks to the new design of this kit. The parts will have to be held together until the cement is dried. Some clothes pegs would be handy for this job. Next, following the same process of cutting and sanding, the wings and tail surfaces can be removed from the sprues, cemented together as per the instructions and installed onto the model. I would like to point out that I'd already decided to model this aircraft with its landing gear raised to make it look as if it was flying. The option to have the landing gear lowered is included, but it will require a little more fine paint work if this is the option you choose. Whilst you watch the final steps of this assembly, I'll tell you a little bit about the actual Supermarine Spitfire Mk1a. Designed in the mid-1930s, the RAF took delivery of its first Spitfires in 1938, shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. It featured elliptical wings, which could handle high-stress manoeuvres, allowing it to turn tighter than its nemesis, the German Messerschmitt 109. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could reach a top speed of 365 miles per hour in level flight, and with 8 .303-inch Browning machine guns, it was a fearsome opponent in the skies. Although there were more Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, and you can find a build of the Airfix Hawker Hurricane on my channel, the sleek lines and elegance of the Spitfire really captured the hearts of the British population, becoming one of the icons of the war. The aircraft that Airfix have decided to depict in this model kit is that of a machine from 610 Squadron, based at RAF Biggin Hill in July 1940. With the majority of construction completed, I then start painting the model. I start by painting the underside with Humbrol 90. To get the best results with acrylic paints, they can be thinned with water, although specialist thinners are available. I tend to do about a 1:2 ratio of thinner to paint, but you may have to experiment with what works best for you. The reason the paint can be thinned is in order to avoid leaving brushstrokes on the finished model. Keeping the paint more fluid until it dries will result in fewer visible lines. My general rule of thumb is to start with the lightest colour first, then progress to the darker colours. I find that it's always easiest to paint a dark colour over a light one rather than the other way round. Having completed the first coat, the upper surfaces of the aircraft were then painted with their relevant colours. I tend to hand brush all the paint, following the painting instructions as a guide on the back of the box of the kit. When all the paint had properly dried, I then applied a varnish coat over the top of the model. I used Humbrol 135, which is a satin varnish. A satin or gloss varnish should be used as the base for the application of decals, as this prevents the decals from appearing silver and shiny on the model. Whilst the varnish was drying, I decided to paint the canopy. The frames of the cockpit glass need painting Humbrol 30 dark green, and I did this by hand using a fine paintbrush. If you make a mistake with acrylic on this clear plastic, it can be carefully scraped away. When the satin varnish was dry, it was time to apply the decals. The decals were soaked in warm water and then gently applied to the kit, which had already been given a coat of decal set solution in the relevant position. The decals are positioned and left to cure. The solution allows for the decals to conform to the complicated contours and details of the model and look like they're painted on. Humbrol Decal Fix is a product that can be used to soften the decals. For more information on how to apply decals, I made a video on this topic, so have a look for it on my channel. The next step is to apply a further coat of matte varnish, Humbrol 49, to the model, which ensures an even finish and helps blend the decals into the model, resulting in the same uniform overall finish. I chose a matte varnish as the Spitfire wouldn't have been particularly shiny, which could have given away its position in a battle. The final stage, as per the instructions, was to install the cockpit canopy. I used a clear all-purpose adhesive for the canopy in an attempt to prevent it from reacting with the glue and fogging up, which polycement has a habit of doing. That's as far as the instructions take you with the construction of this kit, and here is what it looks like at this point. If you're happy at this stage, then congratulations, you've just built your first model kit. I felt that I could do a little bit of extra detailing, however. So here are a few extra things you might like to try and do to your kit. My first improvement was to dry brush silver over the model to give it a light metallic effect and highlight the details. Using Humbrol number 11 silver, I removed the majority of the paint off of the paintbrush onto a paper towel. Then, with the residual paint, I brushed it over the model. Only the raised details collected the silver paint and made them look slightly chipped, as if revealing the bare metal underneath. I then picked out the red navigation light on the left wing and the red areas around the machine gun ports with Humbrol 174 using a fine paintbrush. The next stage was to apply a dark wash, which I made from black pastel dust, water and a drop of washing up liquid. This was then painted onto the model and then removed again using a damp towel. The surface of the model is wiped clean, but the panel lines and sunken details collect the wash and it highlights those details. I then decided to add stains from the engine exhausts and gun ports. To do this, I again used a black pastel, but instead this time I rubbed it into the relevant area of the kit, then dragged a dry paintbrush over the top in the direction of the airflow whilst it was in flight. This drags the dust away, leaving a realistic stain. The final step was to install the radio wires. I used my standard method of stretching the leftover sprue by heating it up over a candle and then drawing the two ends away from each other to make a really fine wire. Be super careful with this step. For more information on this method, I've got a video featuring this technique on my channel, so why not check it out? These fine wires were then cut to length and a small dot of polycement used to glue them in the correct place on the model. They were then painted black to blend them in. And that's as far as I went with the construction of this Spitfire Mk1a model kit. And here are the finished results. I found it didn't take too long to complete. It really helps that the acrylic paints have a fast drying time. So realistically, the kit can be constructed in about 8 hours with a little patience. It's quite easy to build, but perhaps a little fiddly at times, especially if it's your first kit, but practice does make perfect. As I said previously, this is a more recently designed model from Airfix, and having built both this version and the older one, this is finer in its detail and it fits together better. If I were to build it again, I'd probably do some fictional paint schemes, perhaps involving a science fiction theme, or maybe make a diorama where it's in combat with another aircraft and model all the associated damage. What do you have planned with your kit? This kit is available in different versions, either as a part of a starter set or on its own, which comes with different decal options. Airfix have a habit of constantly releasing this kit in different paint schemes, so this particular version may not always be in stock, but there is always a Spitfire kit in their range. I'll add the link to the latest version at the time this video is made, underneath the video if you want to see for yourself. This kit retails for about £10 in the United Kingdom, which is a reasonable price in my opinion, but as always, I do like to try and find a deal, so I managed to get it a bit cheaper. I'm impressed with this new version of this iconic aircraft from Airfix, and more than happy with the finished results I've achieved with my Supermarine Spitfire Mk1a. As always, let me know what you think of my build, techniques and finished model in the comments below. And if you're just starting out in the hobby or returning after a break, I'd be eager to hear what you've got planned for your first builds. I'm also keen to hear your suggestions as to other kits that you'd like to see me build on my channel, so feel free to post that too. All that's left to say is thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe in order to see more content and help support the channel. And feel free to connect with me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. See you all again next time.